Hey guys, so this video is on finding the inverse. So first of all, we have a function here, function f, and it is 2 times the quantity x plus 3 squared minus 4. Remember, the square is what makes it a quadratic function. So the steps for finding the inverse. The first step is to switch the x and the y. Switch the x and the y. So since f of x represents y, it's going to become x. And x is going to become y. So I switched the x and the y. Second step, solve for y. Okay? So since y is buried into this parentheses, we're going to need to get rid of everything on the outside. So remember that when solving, we undo adding and subtracting first. So we get x plus 4 okay? And then we undo multiplying and dividing. So this is 2 times. So we're going to undo times with divide. Okay, so now we have x plus 4 over 2. And I wrote 2. I must be tired. It's Friday afternoon. Equals. All right, next thing we want to do, now as we're doing this, remember we're doing PEMDAS backwards. So we already undid adding and subtracting. Now we've undone multiplying. Next is exponent. So to undo square, we're going to square root. So we're square rooting both sides. Okay, so we have the square root of x plus 4 over 2 equals y plus 3. Okay, now we're inside the parentheses, so we're going to undo the plus 3. So we have the square root. I like to put a little tail to know that's the end of that, and minus 3. And we're going to put a negative 1 on the y. The negative 1 tells us that this function is an inverse. It's the inverse of this function. And actually, if we want to be in function notation, we would do it like this. Function notation. Okay, so let's take a look at what this looks like graphically. So here's our quadratic. So I'm going to go ahead and plug that in to y1. And then I'm going to take my square root function and plug it in. So remember that this is 1 over 2. So I use 0.5. Easier to put in the calculator. 1 over 2 is 0.5. And then 4 divided by 2 is 2. And then I have my minus 3. Now here's the thing with square root. If you're going to graph it and see the whole picture, you need to have a positive and you have to have a negative. Again, when you do the inverse, okay, you need a positive and a negative. So let's graph it. So here's my original function. And here's my inverse function. Actually, it's not a function. My inverse relation, because it doesn't pass the vertical line test, so it's not a function. Okay? Also, one thing to keep in mind when you're doing inverses, the line of reflection is going to be y equals x. Y equals x is going to be your line of reflection. See how it cuts it in two? So that means if I flipped this over, it'll land right on top of its inverse. And if I flip that over, it'll land right on top of that one. So let's write that down. Y equals x is your line of reflection. Okay, make sure you study this, look it over, digest it, try to understand it. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is, I know there was something else. Let me think for a minute. You know, I'm not going to go ahead and go into factoring. I'd rather spend just a little bit of time talking about domain and range again. So, domain is left to right. Okay? Range is lowest to highest. Domain is x, range is y. So when you look at this graph, okay, let's take a look at the parent, not the parent, excuse me, the quadratic. You know, this is your furthest left point, and you don't see one here, but there's it's like an arrow. It keeps going and going and going and going infinitely. It's going infinitely up, and it's going infinitely to the left. So we're going to use interval notation, and we're going to go infinitely to the left, okay, and you're going to go infinitely to the right. And you use parentheses because you can never reach infinity. You can never reach infinity. This is interval notation. I figured you might need some help with your worksheet this weekend. Okay? Now, let's do interval, lowest to highest. So our lowest point here is at -4. Our lowest point here is -4. And it's a solid dot. It's an actual point. So we're going to use brackets. And then my highest point is an arrow. Remember, it keeps going infinitely. So we're going to go to infinity on the other side. That's interval notation. Okay? Now set notation. Set notation, we have to write x is an element of what type of numbers. So the type of numbers that fall from negative infinity to positive infinity encompass all real numbers. All of them. Okay? No exception. All of them. So basically, that's all we have to write. That x is an element of all real numbers. Now over here, we can't say that encompasses all of them, so we're going to have to add a little something to be specific. But from -4 to infinity, that has real numbers. Okay, so we're going to say x is an element of real numbers. Okay, such that x is greater than or equal to -4. Now here's where we're using the inequality notation within the set notation, because we're going from -4 and the range values are getting bigger. And I keep doing this, and I apologize, and I think I did it on the other video too, but I caught myself. I'm sorry. What mistake did I make? Range is y. So I apologize. I'm tired and I don't know what I'm thinking. Y. So all values starting at -4 and getting bigger So y is greater than or equal to -4. So there's set notation, there's interval notation, and I expect you to do both notations on the worksheet. I realize there's not a lot of space, but make it work. See you on Monday.